The sun came earlier now. It slipped through the curtains. Before my alarm could. I didn't mind. The morning light was a gentler kind of guest, arriving without questions. I sat with my tea near the window, the chipped cup warming my palms. Outside, the cherry trees were beginning to blush. Not fully in bloom, just hinting. Across the street, a young woman walked her daughter to school. They paused at the corner. The child pointed up at a bird I couldn't see. The mother looked, smiled, and nodded. I smiled too. These days, I didn't need much to feel full. A warm seat, a song that began off-key but found its way, a letter from someone who still believed in paper. That afternoon, I visited the center. Arlene waved me over. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," she said. Inside the rehearsal room, a new girl sat near the back. 16, maybe. Hair pulled tight, hands clenched in her lap. She didn't speak, but her eyes watched everything. Not with fear, with hunger. Arlene leaned in and whispered, "She hasn't sung since her father passed, but she asked to hold a tambourine." I nodded, took a seat in the back beside her, said nothing. Eventually, she tapped her finger against the skin of the tambourine. Not loud, just once. Then again. A rhythm beginning. I didn't lead the group that day, just listened. Sometimes, the most important thing you can offer is your presence. Not your advice, not your story, just your being. I walked home with the sound still in my ears. Not music, not yet, but something forming, something true. That evening, I took out my husband's old metronome, set it on the windowsill, let it tick. The sound was soft, steady, a heartbeat you could hear. I placed my hand against the wood, closed my eyes, and breathed. I didn't think of what I had lost. Not the house, not the wedding, not even the title, mother of the groom. I thought of what I had chosen, and of who I had become. In the quiet that followed, because legacy is not made of what you pass down. It's made of what you refuse to let die inside yourself. Even when no one's watching. Even when no one says thank you. Especially then. The world didn't owe me a stage. But I built one anyway. And left the lights on. For whoever came next. The afternoon sun warmed the edge of the windowsill. The candle had burned low. But not out. And I sat there. Quiet. Still. Whole. What does legacy mean to you? If you've ever had to choose silence over recognition, or dignity over applause, we invite you to share your story below. You are not alone in your journey. Your voice still matters. Your second act begins whenever you are ready. Subscribe to Kamar FM, where every story is a second chance. The piano was already open, but the keys stayed quiet that morning. I had baked a small almond cake. Not the fanciest, but it was our family recipe, my late husband's favorite. I wore the green dress Richard once said made me look like spring itself. It no longer fit perfectly, but it still held the shape of my youth. The drive to Cape Cod was long, but the sky was kind. Overcast, gentle, like it knew I didn't want too much attention. At the resort, I arrived early. Always had a habit of helping with chairs, napkins, little things. Tessa met me at the side entrance. Her heels clicked like punctuation. Her perfume smelled expensive, something crisp, citrusy, and cold. She looked at the cake in my hands, like I was holding a dead bird. "This isn't your place, Evelyn," she said. "You're just the guest, please leave." There was no malice in her voice, just smooth finality. I turned to Richard. He stood behind her, lips pressed into a pale line. He didn't say a word, not even a whisper. And that silence, it cracked louder than any scream. I set the cake down on a linen-covered table and walked away. Back through the gravel drive, past white folding chairs still wet with dew, past the spot where I had planned to take a photo with my son. I got in the car, placed my hands on the wheel, and waited. not for someone to chase after me. I knew no one would. I waited, because my heart needed to catch up with what had just happened. In that moment, I wasn't a mother. I wasn't part of the celebration. I was an afterthought, with good intentions, and no place to stand. And yet, something in me stayed upright, a thin thread, trembling, but unbroken. He had let her erase me. But I hadn't erased myself. Not yet. If your child let you be erased from the most important day of their life, would you still call it love? It started with a suggestion. Maybe it's time to refresh the place, Mom, Richard said over the phone. Just a few updates, some modern lighting. Maybe repaint the paneling. I said nothing. The paneling had been hand-brushed by my husband, while Ella Fitzgerald played from the kitchen radio. Next came the emails. Tessa forwarding links to furniture companies. Soft grays, glass tables, chrome lamps. Not a single item made of wood. No corners worn soft by elbows and books. No place for memory to hide. Then came the message I couldn't ignore. Hi, Evelyn, just checking. Would you mind if we donated some of the older pieces? Especially that floral armchair. It's a bit much for the new aesthetic. The floral armchair. That was where I had nursed Richard when he had croup. Where I had sat on Christmas Eve, mending socks, while carols crackled on the record player. I stared at the message. And for a moment, I couldn't remember the last time someone asked me how I felt. Not about the chair, but about anything. The next time they visited, I noticed something missing. The pewter frame that once held our family photo had been quietly replaced with an abstract canvas in navy and white. When I asked where it went, Tessa smiled. Oh, it didn't match the hallway anymore. We put it in a drawer. We didn't throw it out, of course. Of course. Only tucked it away, like a keepsake from a trip no one took anymore. One afternoon, I opened the drawer. The frame was still there, but the glass had cracked. I don't know when it happened. Maybe in transit. Maybe from disuse. The crack ran right through my husband's face. And part of mine, Richard's smile, however, was untouched. I didn't fix the glass. I left it. Sometimes, truth looks better unpolished. That night, I made tea. Chamomile. The same blend I used to brew when Richard couldn't sleep. The scent filled the room, and I sat in the dark. Holding the chipped mug with both hands, I whispered into the stillness. Where did I go? Not out loud. Not really. Just enough for the walls to hear me. And they did. They always did. The floor creaked beneath my feet. Not from wear, but from memory. Every board in that house knew the rhythm of my life. The rise and fall of seasons. Of songs once sung and now silent. The soft give beneath the third plank near the piano. Where Richard used to jump off barefoot, pretending he was Peter Pan. He'd land with a dramatic thud, then bow like he was on stage. I always clapped, even when it was just the two of us. The chipped corner of the kitchen counter was from when my husband dropped the Thanksgiving turkey in '92. He laughed so hard that day, I thought he might never catch his breath again. The gravy stain stayed on the tile for years. I never scrubbed it out completely. Some memories are worth keeping in the cracks. Now, the counter just sat there. Quiet. Reliable. Forgotten. Like me, I ran my fingers across the top of the grand piano. The wood had darkened with time, but it still responded to gentle touch, as if waiting to be remembered. There were fingerprints on the lid mine, and beneath it, a sheet of music with faded ink. Spring Echoes for RC. My husband wrote it after our first summer by the lake. His handwriting, slanted and steady, always calmed me more than any prescription ever could. I never performed it. It was always meant to be played only in this house, and only by me. Some mornings, I'd sit on the bench, not to play, just to feel the weight of time settle around me, to breathe in the quiet, to remember who I had been, before I became a ghost in other people's calendars. Outside, the lake shimmered, still partly covered in frost, the last breath of winter refusing to let go. Geese drifted past like slow commas. On the sentence of morning, I remembered teaching Richard to swim in that lake. He cried the first time water touched his ears. I held him close, told him, everything brave begins a little cold. He stopped crying after that. These days, I didn't hear from him much. Calls became brief. Visits turned into texts. The last time he came up here, he said the smell of old wood made his sinuses act up. Tessa had never visited. She once told me over dinner in Boston, "This house is charming, in a Little Women kind of way." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I didn't reply. I just stirred my tea and thought of all the lives that had begun in that house. She wore linen suits, high collars, always looked pressed, as if wrinkles themselves were offensive. I wore old cardigans with loose buttons, because they had known better hugs than anything new. But lately, even I started to wonder, was the house holding on to me, or was I just afraid to leave? The only place that still remembered me? What would you do if the walls that knew your soul? It started feeling like a museum. No one walked into? This story began with silence, but maybe you felt that silence too. The kind that speaks louder than any insult. If this touched something in you, tell us where you're listening from. You're not alone, not here. The old camp banner still hung in the attic. Harmony Haven, summer '88. Letters stitched by my choir girls. Uneven, but full of joy. I used to run music workshops here. Children came from Boston, Portland even, as far as Albany. Many had never seen a lake before. The mornings began with group warm-ups on the dock. Do Re-my rising into the mist. Their little voices echoing across the water, like tiny birds testing their wings. I kept their letters. Some still write to me. Thank you for teaching me to breathe through fear. Your house was the first place I ever felt safe. I'd read those words when the silence in my kitchen felt especially cruel. Sometimes I'd go into the old supply closet, run my fingers across the dusty rows of tambourines, color-coded sheet folders, and jars of sharpened pencils. I missed the smell of construction paper and fruit punch spilled on the porch steps. I missed the barefoot stampede after lunch, the piano keys getting stuck with peanut butter. One summer, Richard helped as an assistant. He was 12. He wore a lanyard and insisted on being called Mr. Carter. He had a whistle he never used, and a clipboard that made him feel important. At night, we'd sit by the fireplace. He'd roast marshmallows, ask endless questions about melodies and timing. That summer, he told me he wanted to be a conductor like me. I believed him. Years passed. His interests shifted: hotels, finance, big cities. That was fine. People change. But what I didn't see coming was how completely he erased that part of himself. When I once brought up the choir camp at a dinner with his colleagues, he smiled tight and said, "Yeah, Mom used to do that. Very sweet. Very sweet." As if I'd once made gingerbread houses, instead of raising voices in confidence, out of broken children. I smiled back. I didn't argue, but I felt it. Something precious, slipping quietly into the space between us. At home, I played Spring Echoes on loop. Those nights after visiting him. Sometimes just the first few bars. I never made it to the end. The house heard it all, and held it without judgment. How do you grieve? A child who's still alive. Just somewhere else entirely? It was a Wednesday. When I saw the photos online, someone had tagged Richard in a post. A small dinner party at their townhouse in Boston. Warm lighting, soft jazz, glasses raised in a toast. Tessa in a cream dress. Richard in a navy jacket I'd given him 2 birthdays ago. 12 guests. 1 long table. A birthday cake with golden numbers. 50. His 50th. I hadn't been invited. Not even told. I stared at the screen for a long while. The caption said, "So grateful to celebrate this milestone with our chosen family." Chosen family. The words stung. Not like a slap. More like stepping barefoot into cold water. Slow, shocking, and unforgiving. I scrolled again. One picture showed the dining room. On the wall, where the upright piano used to sit in his childhood home, now hung a framed quote, "The best is yet to come." I'd heard that before. From him. Once, long ago, when we stayed up past midnight after his high school recital. He had played Debussy, his hands still trembling afterward. I told him I was proud. He leaned into my shoulder and whispered it. "The best is yet to come, Mom." Now, the phrase hung sterile on a wall, curated and cropped. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my reading chair, a worn blanket across my knees, and listened to the radiator hum. The kind of hum that doesn't comfort, just reminds you the silence is real. In the morning, I texted him. "Looks like a lovely evening. Hope it was a happy birthday." He replied 2 hours later. "Thanks, Mom. Just something small. Didn't want to make a fuss." No apology. No mention of the photos. No invitation. Belated or otherwise. I typed and deleted a dozen replies. None felt right. None felt quiet enough for the kind of grief I was carrying. Later that week, Lucille stopped by after yoga. She brought scones, still warm. She could tell something was wrong. "I don't know," I said, tearing the edge of a napkin. "I feel like I've been softly put away." She didn't ask questions. She just poured the tea and handed me the sugar with both hands. That kindness, it nearly broke me. Because it had been so long since anyone looked at me like I still mattered. And somehow, that small act felt more like a celebration than the party I never attended. I used to be in the family group chat. It was called the Carters. I didn't choose the name. Richard did. It started after he married his first wife. A place for holiday plans. Pictures of Eloise when she was just a baby. Reminders about birthdays. Even silly things. Polls about where to order takeout. And blurry pictures of their dog in Halloween costumes. I never said much, but I always read every word. And then, without warning, the messages just stopped coming. I waited a few days, thinking maybe they were busy. Maybe Tessa didn't like group texts. Maybe it was technical. So I asked. Richard responded, "Oh, we made a new thread when we started planning the wedding." I figured the old one was just too cluttered. "No big deal, Mom. No big deal." I said it was fine. I said I understood. And then I stared at the empty screen, like it might apologize for going quiet. But screens don't explain themselves. They just stop blinking. Like someone closing a window and forgetting you were still outside. The next time I saw Tessa, she handed me a wedding invitation. Ivory cardstock, heavy, with gold lettering and embossed edges. It read, "You are cordially invited to the union of Tessa Lee Morgan and Richard Allen Carter on Saturday, the 12th of August. No mother of the groom, no mention of family, just names. Clean, sanitized." I turned it over in my hands, twice, before setting it on the hall table. It stayed there for 3 days, not because I was angry, but because I didn't know what part I was supposed to play anymore. No one had asked what I'd like to wear. No one asked if I wanted to speak. No talk of family songs. No mention of the piano. Even the dinner seating chart, I only learned later, placed me at table 9, far from the head table, near the bathrooms. I once sang a lullaby for Richard, while holding him on that very arm that would now rest beside the coat check. They weren't cruel, just careful, as if my presence was something to be managed, instead of welcomed. That's the hardest kind of erasure, when no one raises their voice, but every detail whispers, "You don't belong here." I still remember the rehearsal dinner, not because of anything that was said, but because of everything that wasn't. I arrived 10 minutes early, Old habit. Teachers never shake that. The room was lovely. String lights curled along the beams. Candles flickered in hurricane jars. And the scent of roasted rosemary hung in the air. My name card had been handwritten, placed neatly at the end of a long table, next to an empty seat. It wasn't near Richard, or Tessa, or anyone I recognized. Across from me was a man from Tessa's company. We made polite conversation. Weather, wine, traffic from the Cape. When I mentioned the camp, he smiled with his mouth only. "That's wonderful," he said, and turned to refill his glass. No one asked me for stories about Richard. No one raised a toast to the parents. When Tessa's father spoke, he thanked the couple for their independence, modern vision, and grace. I clapped with everyone else, but my hands felt cold. Later, I stepped out onto the terrace. The ocean wind pulled at the hem of my shawl, the same one I'd worn to my husband's retirement party. Back then, Richard had looped his arm around mine, grinning with cake on his cheek. That night, he had danced with me to Blue Skies. At the rehearsal dinner, he barely looked my way. A nod from across the room, like an acknowledgement between neighbors. I stood by the railing, watching the lantern sway. Below, waves brushed the rocks. Soft, persistent, like they were trying to remember something. Someone stepped out. Tessa's mother. She smiled. Tight and practiced. "You must be proud," she said. I wasn't sure how to answer, so I just nodded. Pride had once been loud in me. It had filled concert halls, echoed in harmonies built from children's voices, lived in every page of Richard's school music folder. But now, it felt quiet, reduced, like something folded and packed away, for someone else to carry. That night, back in the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed. The sheets were crisp, but smelled faintly of bleach. I stared at my suitcase, still half unpacked, my green dress hanging beside the closet door. The one I wore when Richard graduated, when he still reached for my hand in public. The silence pressed against my chest. Not heavy, but hollow. There's a loneliness that comes, not from being left behind, but from being included, with conditions. When you're only invited out of duty, is it better to stay silent, or to finally step away with your dignity intact? The invoice arrived on a Tuesday. An email from the resort. Subject line, remaining balance, Carter, Morgan event. I clicked it without thinking. Just a routine confirmation. Or so I assumed. The page opened. A logo in gold. Then the numbers. Subtotal, 73,440. Amount paid to date, 40,10. Balance due, 32,440. At the bottom, a small note. Pending payment per Mrs. Evelyn Carter's instructions. I read it twice, 3 times. I hadn't remembered it being that much. But I also hadn't asked. I had simply told Richard, "If this makes her happy, I'll help." He had said thank you. A quick hug in the kitchen. No eye contact. I thought it was gratitude. Now I wondered if it was guilt. The resort hadn't billed them. They had billed me. Because I had offered. But no one had stopped to ask. Was I still offering? Did I still want to pay? After being placed at the edge of my son's new life, like a decorative fern no one waters? I closed the tab. My reflection flickered in the screen for a second. Drawn. Soft around the edges. The kind of face people thank, but rarely look at. I opened the cabinet above the stove. Pulled out the tin box where I kept old receipts, concert programs, notes from former students. I found the transfer slip I'd signed at the bank. Richard had come with me. He held the pen out. I remember that. Just to reserve the date, he'd said. We can adjust later. But there had been no adjusting. Only assuming. Only silence. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Hands folded. Eyes dry. The kind of stillness that comes when the storm hasn't hit yet, but you already hear the wind turning. That night, I played the piano, softly, not to soothe, but to remember what control felt like. Each note landed where I chose, held for as long as I allowed. Unlike money, unlike love, unlike the weight of unspoken debts, no one intended to repay. I waited until after dinner to call, not out of politeness, out of hesitation. I made tea first. Earl Grey. 2 sugars. The way I always did when I needed to steady my hands. The phone rang 4 times. Then Richard answered. His voice light, rushed. Hey, Mom? Everything okay? I almost changed my mind. Almost asked about the weather instead. But I didn't. I got the invoice from the resort today, I said. Tried to keep my tone even. Just enough warmth to not sound accusatory. Oh yeah, he said, like I'd reminded him to take out the trash. I think they just needed a final confirmation. It's all in your name, right? In my name, I repeated. He didn't notice the pause. Or maybe he did, and chose not to walk into it. Yeah. They just needed a card on file for the balance. It should go through before the weekend. They said the florist required it to release the arrangements. I held the phone tighter. Tried to find the right question. Not to catch him. Just to be seen. Did you ever plan to ask me? Silence. Then a sigh. Drawn out. Mom, come on. You said you'd take care of it. You said you wanted to help. I thought we'd moved past this kind of nitpicking. Nitpicking. The word thudded in my chest. Like a misplayed note. I'm not nitpicking, I said quietly. I just didn't realize helping meant disappearing. More silence. Not cruel. Just calculated. Like someone trying to manage a minor inconvenience. Look, I didn't mean it like that. It's just. A lot's been going on. Tessa's stressed. I'm trying to keep things smooth. This wedding is bigger than we imagined. You know how these things go. Yes. I knew. Weddings grow. Love shrinks. He wrapped up quickly after that. Said they were heading out to a tasting. Thanked me again. Called me the best. The best. Like a flavor. A favorite candle. Something useful. Until the wick burns down. I stared at the phone in my hand. Long after the line went dead. And for the first time in years, I didn't cry. I just sat there, listening to the walls. They knew. They'd heard it too. That night, I opened my ledger. It wasn't fancy. Just a spiral notebook with faded lines. And my handwriting looping in blue ink. I'd kept it for decades. Every major purchase. Every loan to a neighbor. Every music scholarship I ever funded. For the children who couldn't afford a violin, but had the hands of a cellist. Page after page. Piano tunings. Roof repairs. Camp uniforms. Bus rentals. Snacks for the choir retreat in '93. There, near the back, was the last entry. Wedding gift. Upfront deposit. Carter. Morgan. No line drawn under it. No date paid in full. Just open. Like a wound. I closed the book. Set it gently back in the drawer. Sat in the hush of the kitchen. As the kettle cooled. Around me, the house rested. Every floorboard. A memory I had invested in. The cabinets my husband built with his own hands. The sewing machine tucked into the corner, where I once mended tights for a little girl in the children's chorus. The bookshelf he sanded for Richard's picture books. Still sturdy. Still giving. I ran my fingers along the window pane. Outside, the moonlight brushed the lake, with a silver so soft it almost looked like forgiveness. I wasn't bitter. That's the part no one ever believes. I was tired. Not from giving. I loved giving. Giving was a language I spoke fluently. But I had forgotten. Giving without being seen turns you invisible. And invisible things are easy to overlook. Easy to walk past at weddings. Easy to forget at dinner tables. Easy to thank, but never invite. They had taken my money, my name, my place at the table, piece by piece, without asking. Because I had made it easy. Because I had said yes. Too many times. Without waiting to be asked properly. The quiet wasn't cruel, but it was efficient. And that made it more dangerous. I turned off the lights, stood alone in the center of the living room, and said just loud enough for the walls to hear, "This is not unkindness, but it is not love either." When someone takes what you offer with open hands, but refuses to hold your presence with the same care, is that still generosity? Or is it just erasure by another name? I didn't leave the house for 3 days. The phone rang once. I let it. The message blinked, but I didn't press play. Outside, the lake shimmered. In that strange in-between of spring. No longer frozen, but not yet warm. I moved less. Ate less. Thought too much. Not about revenge. Just about the strange quiet that fills a house. When you no longer believe, you are needed in it. I folded laundry that didn't matter. Placed sheets back into drawers no one would open. Dusted books, whose spines I knew by touch, but whose stories I suddenly could not remember. I reheated soup. I didn't taste. Tea went cold, 3 times in a row. The fourth, I poured it out untouched. That afternoon, I walked into the guest bedroom, the one with the blue quilt and the chipped nightstand. My husband built that nightstand with leftover wood from the porch. He sanded it with his hands. They bled, but he whistled the entire time. There was a photo on the dresser. Us, younger, at a music festival in Vermont. He had flour on his nose. I was laughing. My head thrown back like I didn't know what grief was yet. I picked up the frame, not to clean it, but to hold something that once felt permanent. And then, I sat on the bed and stayed there. For hours, I watched the shadows climb the walls as the sun shifted and realized something I hadn't wanted to say out loud. This house no longer needed me. Not the way it once did. Not as a camp, a school, a home, or a memory. It had outlived its music, and so had I. That night, I pulled the green dress from the closet, the one I had worn when I thought I'd be standing beside Richard as he stepped into his next chapter. The fabric smelled of cedar, still smooth, still soft at the cuffs. I ran my fingers along the hem, looking for a reason to keep it out, to press it, to prepare. But I folded it instead, placed it gently into the trunk, at the foot of my bed, closed the lid, not with anger, but with a kind of stillness that follows when something inside you goes quiet for good. I didn't cry, not then, but I knew something had ended, and whatever came next, I would have to build it with different hands. The lake was still. The morning I decided to leave. Not forever. At least, that's what I told myself. But something in me knew, when you pack memory into boxes, you rarely unpack it the same way again. I didn't tell anyone. No calls. No announcements. I moved like a whisper, through the spaces that had once sung. The kitchen was first. I placed the tea tins into a small crate, left behind the chipped mug, the one with the treble clef. It belonged to the house more than it did to me. I folded the checkered napkins that had soaked up years of music, camp laughter, tucked them into linen pouches, as if they were something sacred. Upstairs, I opened the drawer beside the piano bench. Sheet music, fingering guides, a copy of Spring Echoes, my husband's composition, worn soft at the edges. I traced the ink, as if it might smudge under the pressure of remembering. Then I folded it and slid it into an envelope, not labeled, not sealed, just carried. The piano I left untouched. Closing the lid felt too final, so I left it open, like a sentence trailing off. By midday, the house smelled of cedar and stillness. I had left the windows open. The breeze moved through, like it too was saying goodbye. I stood in the doorway with my suitcase, one medium-sized bag. Just enough for now. Just enough to not look back. Lucille had offered her guest room in Vermont, a small town, a community center that hosted workshops for senior learning and arts. I had brushed it off before. Now, it felt like a lifeline I didn't know I'd been reaching for. As I closed the door, the wood creaked. That familiar protest. Not angry, just old. I pressed my palm flat against the frame, felt the grain, let it feel me back. I loved you, I whispered. Not to the house, but to the version of me that had built a life inside it. And then, I walked away. The gravel crunched under my feet. The wind pulled gently at my coat. A single leaf skittered across the path ahead, bright and red, as if even autumn had arrived. Before I was ready, I didn't cry. I didn't turn around. Some endings aren't loud. They don't beg to be witnessed. They just unfold, like a final note, played too softly to echo, but never quite lost. Because even silence, when chosen, is a kind of song. The community center smelled like lemon polish and paper, the kind of scent that doesn't change with the seasons. Lucille met me at the door, carrying 2 canvas tote bags and a hopeful smile. I signed us up for the Tuesday group, she said, as if that explained everything. Inside, the floors were scuffed but clean, chairs in mismatched rows, a whiteboard with faded marker lines, and in the corner, an upright piano, its wood a little warped, its bench too short. But it was there, waiting. The group was small. 7 women, all older, all with eyes that had seen more than they told. One of them wore a brooch shaped like a violin. Another hummed while she set down her coat. No one asked where I was from. No one asked what I had left behind. They only made space and poured tea from a chipped thermos. That first session, we didn't play anything. We just talked about rhythm and breath and the feeling of singing in a room where no one is trying to outshine you. Someone asked, "What does music mean to you now?" I hadn't expected the question. It sat on my tongue for a moment, heavy and uncertain. Then I said, "It means I'm still here." A few women nodded. One of them touched her chest. And just like that, the silence felt softer. That evening, I walked home alone. The sidewalk was uneven, lined with bare trees and quiet porches. I stopped outside the bakery, watched an old couple split a cinnamon bun, and laughed through powdered sugar. It wasn't envy I felt. It wasn't longing either. It was something quieter, like recognition. Back at Lucille's, my suitcase sat unopened at the foot of the bed. I hadn't needed much, just a few sweaters, a notebook, and the envelope holding spring echoes. I placed it on the nightstand, then sat down, opened the notebook, and wrote 2 words on the first page. Begin again. The letters trembled, but they were mine. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't writing to preserve something. I was writing to discover what hadn't been taken. The following Tuesday, they asked me to lead warm-ups, just for a few minutes, just to get the breath moving. I hesitated, my hands folded in my lap, as if seeking permission from a version of me that hadn't stood in front of people for years. Lucille nudged me, not with words, just the gentlest pressure of her elbow. I stood, cleared my throat. The walls of the small room felt closer than any concert hall I'd ever stepped into. "Let's begin with breath," I said. It came back like muscle memory. 4 counts in, hold for 2, and then out like a candle. They followed, some chests rising unevenly. One woman closed her eyes, as if the air itself was a kind of prayer. We hummed after that, low and slow, like bees testing the air. After a long winter, I watched them, not their posture, not their pitch, their eyes, their breath. There was no stage here, no performance, only women, trying to find their voice, without asking anyone's permission. And in the middle of it, I forgot the cost of weddings, the echo of names unsaid, the photo frame that cracked through my smile. I only remembered how it felt to create something without expectation. Afterward, while we were folding chairs, a woman named Arlene came up to me. She had hair, the color of ash, and hands that trembled slightly. When she held her thermos, she said, "I haven't sung in front of anyone since my husband died. You made it feel okay again." I didn't know what to say, so I nodded. Then she added, Do you think joy ever comes back?" Not loud joy, just the kind that fits in your pocket. That question stayed with me, long after the room emptied. Long after Lucille and I walked home, with our scarves pulled tight against the wind. Back in my room, I opened Spring Echoes for the first time in months. I didn't play it, just let my eyes follow the notes. Like tracing a path I used to know by heart. I whispered the first line under my breath. It cracked slightly, but it was still mine. Maybe joy doesn't return. In fireworks, maybe it shows up as a tremble in your throat, and the courage to keep singing anyway. At the end of our third session, Marjorione of the staff volunteers pulled me aside. She had the kind of voice that always sounded like it was smiling, even when the words weren't. "We're planning a small showcase next month," she said. "Just for the community. Seniors, local families, maybe a bake sale in the courtyard." I nodded, waiting. She continued. "We were hoping maybe your group could share a few songs. Nothing big, just something honest." Something honest. That phrase hung in the air, long after she walked away. I sat on the bench near the front window, watching snow begin to gather along the edges of the sidewalk, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just arrives, soft and quiet and sure. Lucille came over, her arms full of scarves the group had knit for the raffle. "You'll say yes, right?" she asked. I hadn't said yes to much lately. Not when people asked what I needed. Not when invitations arrived in the mail, with my name misspelled, or missing entirely. But this wasn't a demand. It wasn't a duty. It was an offering. A gentle one. So I said, "Yes, let's do it." She didn't smile wide, just reached out and touched my hand. It was enough. That evening, I stayed behind in the room alone. Just me and the old upright piano. The keys were uneven. One stuck. But I didn't mind. I played slowly. Just the melody line of Spring Echoes. No harmonies. No build. Only the skeleton of what once was. But even stripped down, it still had breath. It still held me. I thought of the women I now sang with. Of Arlene's trembling voice. Of the way we all leaned slightly forward when someone risked a note too high. No one here tried to be perfect. We only tried to be present. And that, I realized, was the difference. In Bar Harbor, I had been erased, with ceremony. In Vermont, I was being remembered, without needing to prove I belonged. That night, I lit a candle by the windowsill. No occasion. No meaning. Just a small flame that said quietly, "I'm still here." If you've ever had to begin again in a place where no one knew your name, did you find something gentler waiting for you? Share your moment below. You never know who might need to hear it. The idea didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments. A sentence here. A gesture there. Like music before it's written. Just a hum under the breath. It began the day Arlene brought her grandson to rehearsal. He sat quietly in the back, his wheelchair pulled close to the edge of the room. Eyes wide, hands folded. Not speaking, but not absent, either. During warm-ups, he smiled. Just slightly. When we hummed a descending scale, his eyes followed the sound, like it was something alive. After class, Arlene stayed behind. She looked at the piano, the way some people look at locked doors. He loves music, she said. But the programs here, they're not built for kids like him. I didn't ask what like him meant. I didn't need to. I had heard it before. In other towns, in other years, in the soft defeat behind polite sentences. That night, I sat by the radiator with my notebook. Not the one for lesson plans. The other one. The one I'd used to keep track of tuition waivers for music camps gone by. I flipped to the back. The ledger page for the wedding still sat unfinished. 440. Still in my account. Still unspoken for. I circled the number. Then, slowly, wrote beneath it. Harmony Fund. Seed gift. The name came without effort. Harmony. For what had been lost. For what could be made new. Not in Bar Harbor. Not for Richard. Not for legacy photos on someone's mantle. But for this place. This little room with mismatched chairs. This boy in the back row, whose eyes lit up when sound moved. The next morning, I emailed the director of the center. Asked for a meeting. Didn't say why. Just wrote, I have something I'd like to give not in memory, but in motion. When she replied, her message was short. Yes. Absolutely yes. Let me know when. I sat back in the chair. Looked out the window. A sparrow landed on the porch railing, ruffled its feathers, and settled in. It didn't know how long it would stay. It didn't ask if it belonged. It just made space for itself, in the light that was already there. The lawyer's office was small. No marble floors. No glass walls. Just an old building with creaky stairs, and the scent of lemon polish clinging to the banister. His name was Daniel Wu. Mid-40s. Soft-spoken. He wore corduroy. Offered me tea before we even sat down. I liked him instantly. Not because he smiled much, but because he didn't. Not unnecessarily. I read your message, he said, unfolding the papers I'd brought. You want to redirect the remaining funds from a family wedding into a music education initiative for children with physical or cognitive disabilities? I nodded. Not just children, I said. Anyone who's been told. There's no space for you here. He paused, then took out a yellow legal pad. We began to draft. There were details. So many details. Tax structures. Endowment clauses. Naming conventions. He asked if I wanted it in memory of someone. A spouse. A family name. No, I said. Nothing that needs to be approved. By people who didn't think I belonged at their table. He looked at me then. Not as a client. As someone he understood. We wrote, the Harmony Fund is hereby established to provide access to music education for individuals historically excluded from traditional arts programs. He asked if I wanted to notify my family. I shook my head. I've done enough announcing. This isn't about making a point. It's about making room. By the time we finished, the sun had dropped low through the window, casting long shadows on the desk. He slid the final page toward me. Are you sure? I held the pen in my hand. It felt heavier than I remembered, but it fit, like something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I've never been more sure, I said, and I signed. Not for closure, not for recognition, but because I had learned something that took 76 years to know. Your name does not have to be on a guest list to be written into the future. And some legacies. I don't need witnesses. Only intention. The envelope arrived 3 days later. Cream-colored. Unmarked, except for a single return address. In small serif print. It sat in the mailbox, tucked between a grocery flyer and a postcard from Lucille's niece. I knew what it was, but I waited. Not out of doubt. Just reverence. Back in the guest room, I cleared a space on the table, brushed away a few tea crumbs, lit the candle by the window. Then, slowly, I opened the seal. Inside, 3 documents. One official, with a gold embossed heading. Certificate of Registration, Harmony Fund. The name looked strange, printed in typeface. After living so long in my handwriting. But it was real. Beneath it, my signature. My direction. The second page outlined the mission. The language we had chosen. Dedicated to opening space for creative expression. Among those historically excluded. Due to disability, age, circumstance, or silence. It was that last word that stayed with me. Silence. How many years had I lived inside it? Without even realizing. It had a name. The third page was simple. A confirmation of the initial seat amount. 32,440. I remembered the number. From the wedding invoice. The one that never needed me present. Only paying. Now, it served something else. Not as repayment. Not even redemption. But as a beginning, with no apology attached. I placed the papers in a folder. Not to file away, but to keep close. Later that evening, Lucille came in with her arms full of sheet music. Your girls want to sing something new next week, she said. Something bolder. I smiled. Not wide. Just enough for her to see. I hadn't felt small in days. She noticed the folder on the table, tipped her head, but didn't ask. That was the grace of it all. No one in Vermont demanded you explain your joy. Or your quiet victories. I tucked the envelope into the drawer beside my bed, folded my sweater, and sat for a while, with nothing playing in the background. No music, no noise, just breath, and space, and something inside me, settling into its shape. Not everything we give needs to be returned, but sometimes, when we give with intention, the return finds us anyway, not as applause, but as peace. The email came to Richard first. It was forwarded from a colleague at the resort, someone in accounts who handled donor relations. A friendly note. Just wanted to loop you in congratulations to your mother. We're preparing a small press mention next quarter, highlighting the Harmony Fund gift from Mrs. Evelyn Carter. Wonderful legacy initiative. Would love a quote if you're open to it. He reread the lines twice. Then a third time. Harmony Fund. Legacy initiative. Mrs. Evelyn Carter. He opened the attachment. There, in plain font, the language he hadn't heard spoken in years. Seated by an anonymous wedding fund reversal, the Harmony Fund supports adaptive music programs across intergenerational communities in Maine and Vermont. Anonymous wedding fund reversal. His stomach tightened. Not from guilt. Not yet. But from confusion. And something colder. The realization that something had happened, and he hadn't been consulted. He called Tessa. She didn't answer. He forwarded the message. No subject line. Just, did you know about this? She replied, 5 minutes later. One sentence. She pulled the money. That night, they sat in silence at the kitchen table. The same one they'd chosen from a catalog, months before the wedding. Modern lines. Cold steel legs. Wipeable surface. Richard tapped the table once. A dull sound. She didn't tell me. Tessa sipped her wine. Didn't look up. She didn't need to. He let that sit. A truth he didn't want to touch. Then, she paid most of it. She just didn't pay all of it. Tessa finally looked up. She paid enough to feel erased. Maybe that's what it bought her. A way to be seen again, just not by us. They didn't speak after that. In the morning, Richard opened the guest room closet. The green dress was still hanging there, dry cleaned, untouched. He ran his hand along the sleeve, paused. There was no message, no voicemail, no dramatic departure, just absence. Clean, unapologetic, complete. And now, a fund with her name. And her story was being built without needing theirs. The meeting was held in the same room where we rehearsed. Folding chairs in neat rows. A coffee urn by the door. 2 toddlers playing with crayons in the corner. It wasn't a big event. No stage lights. No podium. Just people in cardigans and worn-out shoes, waiting to hear what came next. Evelyn sat in the third row, Lucille beside her, a notebook on her lap, hands folded. Still. At the front, Marjorie cleared her throat. Her voice wavered a little, not from nerves, but from care. "Before we start with this quarter's review," she said, "I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a gift that changed everything." She held up a simple folder, cream-colored, no fanfare. "In February, we received a private donation to begin what will now be called the Harmony Fund for Inclusive Music." There was a rustle in the room. Chairs shifted. Someone's cane bumped the floor. This gift came not from a corporation, not from an estate, but from someone who believed that music should belong to all of us. Not just the able, not just the young, not just the loud. Marjorie looked up, met Evelyn's eyes, didn't ask permission, didn't announce her. She just said, "And she's sitting right here with us today." A few people turned. A few hands reached for hers. But no one clapped. Not because they weren't moved, but because the room understood. This wasn't a performance. It was a restoration. Evelyn nodded. Once, her eyes glassy, but her mouth steady. Later, after the meeting, as people filed out, a teenage girl lingered. She had braces, wore a t-shirt with a treble clef on it, and walked with a slight limp. "Are you the music lady?" she asked. Evelyn smiled. "Sometimes." The girl grinned. "My mom said I can join next term. I've never sung in front of anyone." "You don't have to sing loud," Evelyn said. "Just true." The girl nodded, then ran to catch her ride. Outside, the sky was turning gold. The kind of light that doesn't last, but is enough. In a different city, Richard sat at his desk, staring at the email again. No reply. No next move. The woman who used to wait in the wings had chosen a different stage, and the echo she left behind was not silence, but music he could no longer direct. They received the thank you note a week later, typed, signed by the community center director. Elegant, concise. "On behalf of the Harmony Fund, we thank Mrs. Evelyn Carter for her visionary gift toward inclusive music education." No mention of family. No forwarding address. Just a line at the bottom. Impact report to follow quarterly. Richard folded the paper slowly, set it on the table beside his coffee cup. The room felt too quiet, though nothing had changed, except what he now knew. Tessa stood by the window. She didn't speak. She rarely did when silence said enough. On the mantel, a framed photo of their wedding day. Everyone smiling. Everyone dressed in soft white and gold. Everyone, except Evelyn. She was seated at the edge, half in shadow, her smile polite, her hands folded in her lap, like she'd been placed there, not welcomed. Richard stared at the photo, at the version of her they had captured. Still, quiet, erasable. He realized then they hadn't taken her name off anything. She had removed it herself, removed it from their family thread, from their holiday rotation, from every table where she was invited, but not included. And now, her name lived elsewhere. In songbooks, in laminated posters on community bulletin boards, on scholarship certificates, for children she would never meet. Tessa finally spoke. Soft. Even. She didn't slam the door. "No," Richard said. "She just closed it behind her and built a library where it used to be." He didn't cry. He didn't call. He didn't know what to say. That wouldn't arrive too late. Instead, he sat at the dining room table, where Evelyn had once set down a homemade cake no one touched. He picked up a pen, wrote one word on a scrap of paper. "Mom." Then folded it, placed it in a drawer, closed it gently, Some endings don't echo. They absorb and leave you, listening to your own silence. Is this justice? Or is it too much? What would you have done if someone you loved walked away without needing you to notice? Spring arrived in Vermont without knocking. One morning, the lake was still glass. The next, it moved again. I sat by the window of my small apartment. Above the library, the radio played something old. Strings, soft and familiar, and the scent of coffee drifted up from the bakery below. It had been a year. The Harmony Fund had grown slowly, the way good things do. No headlines, no galas, just a new shelf of instruments. In the storage room at the center, a ramp installed behind the rehearsal wing. Extra warm-up chairs for those who tired easily. Arlene's grandson. He now played tambourine in perfect time. And last month, he sang a solo verse in front of 20 strangers. He hadn't spoken much before. I still met with the group every Tuesday. Same mismatched chairs. Same chip thermos. New voices. Some came with walkers. Some came with hesitation. All left with something loosened. I no longer led every week. But I stayed. Not as a teacher. As a witness. The kind who knows what it means to start again without applause. One afternoon, Lucille handed me a letter. From one of your fun kids, she said, placing it beside my tea. The envelope was pale blue. Inside, a drawing, crayon on heavy paper, a piano, a crooked smile, a girl with one arm holding a microphone. The handwriting was large, unpracticed. Thank you for making room for me. I thought music wasn't for girls like me. Now I sing every Thursday. I folded the letter slowly, not to hide it, to hold it. That night, I opened the window and let the evening air curl around my ankles. The mountains in the distance were still laced with snow at the top, but the valley below was softening. I brewed chamomile, lit one candle, and sat in the quiet, without needing it to explain itself. Sometimes I thought of Richard, of the photo, of the cake I had placed down, and the silence I had chosen instead of protest. I did not regret it. I did not miss the version of myself who waited for permission to speak. Now, when I spoke, it was on my own breath. And when I was silent, it was mine too. There is a kind of peace that doesn't come from being forgiven. It comes from knowing you have nothing left to prove. Not to your children, not to your past, not even to the life you once dreamed of, but had to leave behind. The sun came earlier now. It slipped through the curtains. Before my alarm could. I didn't mind. The morning light was a gentler kind of guest, arriving without questions. I sat with my tea near the window, the chipped cup warming my palms. Outside, the cherry trees were beginning to blush. Not fully in bloom, just hinting. Across the street, a young woman walked her daughter to school. They paused at the corner. The child pointed up at a bird I couldn't see. The mother looked, smiled, and nodded. I smiled too. These days, I didn't need much to feel full. A warm seat, a song that began off-key but found its way, a letter from someone who still believed in paper. That afternoon, I visited the center. Arlene waved me over. There's someone I'd like you to meet, she said. Inside the rehearsal room, a new girl sat near the back. 16, maybe. Hair pulled tight, hands clenched in her lap. She didn't speak, but her eyes watched everything. Not with fear, with hunger. Arlene leaned in and whispered, she hasn't sung since her father passed, but she asked to hold a tambourine. I nodded, took a seat in the back beside her, said nothing. Eventually, she tapped her finger against the skin of the tambourine. Not loud, just once. Then again. A rhythm beginning. I didn't lead the group that day, just listened. Sometimes, the most important thing you can offer is your presence, not your advice, not your story, just your being. I walked home with the sound still in my ears. Not music, not yet, but something forming, something true. That evening, I took out my husband's old metronome, set it on the windowsill, let it tick. The sound was soft, steady, a heartbeat you could hear. I placed my hand against the wood, closed my eyes, and breathed. I didn't think of what I had lost. Not the house, not the wedding, not even the title, Mother of the Groom. I thought of what I had chosen, and of who I had become. In the quiet that followed, because legacy is not made of what you pass down. It's made of what you refuse to let die inside yourself. Even when no one's watching. Even when no one says thank you. Especially then. The world didn't owe me a stage. But I built one anyway. And left the lights on. For whoever came next. The afternoon sun warmed the edge of the windowsill. The candle had burned low. But not out. And I sat there. Quiet. Still. Whole. What does legacy mean to you? If you've ever had to choose silence over recognition, or dignity over applause, we invite you to share your story below. You are not alone in your journey. Your voice still matters. Your second act begins whenever you are ready. Subscribe to Kamar FM, where every story is a second chance.